I am a futurologist. Well, you're very polite. How can anybody have such a ridiculous job title as futurologist? How can you have an ology, which, as you know, means a science or a logic of the future? Isn't that a contradiction in terms? An oxymoron, like military intelligence. Or dare I say, European harmony. Or as a very, very sad man said to me in a bar last weekend, married life. But the reason I use such a ridiculous term to describe what it is that I do, and what I do is I study the big trends of the present to see how they are likely to interact in the future. The reason I use this silly term is to make a point about language itself. And my point is that just as we don't really have a good word for somebody who studies the trends which will shape the future, so I have learned over 30-odd years of doing this that we have no language for the future itself. And I suggest that where there is no language, there can be no concrete or complex thought. I said this not long ago at a university, and a very attractive young man stood up and said, "Excuse me, Mr. Hammond, I think you are mistaken. I'm in the drama department." I could have guessed that. I'm in the drama department. And surely Shakespeare and Dante and Pushkin and others writing hundreds of years ago all had a language for the future. Shakespeare's words are as resonant, as rich, and as meaningful today as they were when he wrote them 400 years ago. I looked at this very handsome young man and I said, "You're correct, sir. I should have said, we have no language for the technological future. Because writers like Shakespeare, Pushkin, Dante, and others were writing about the human condition, about love, about lust, about greed, about envy, about power, all of the things that are immutable and don't change from one generation to another. But our lives today are shaped by technology. And I suggest to you that the reason that we all, myself included, have trouble understanding what's happening today is that technology is arriving at such a pace that it is on us and active before we have found a way of describing it to ourselves and to other people, which allows us to discuss it. We don't have the language. Let me give you an example to make my point. When the device that is throwing these images on the screens was first invented in the Victorian period, the 19th century, we called this device, in the English language, a magic lantern. We could only describe the projector as a lantern that had magic properties. When the automobile, the motor car, was first invented, in the English language, we called it a horseless carriage. We could only describe it as a carriage without horses. The railroad, the locomotive, the engine was called, in the English language, an iron horse. Radio was wireless. Movies were talking pictures. You begin to get my drift that when technology first arrives, we don't have necessarily words that help us understand its potential. Imagine trying to sit around a table in 1901 to discuss the future of the automobile. And you're all sitting there and you're talking about where will these horseless carriages go? How can we best use our horseless carriages? It isn't helpful. And this is afflicting us every single day. For example, the big project today that's been going on for the best part of 40 years, but of course it has picked up speed in recent decades, is the always-on, always connected, everyone to everyone, and very soon everything to everything connected device, which I'm having trouble explaining. Now, you might say it's the internet, but I would say then to you, well, what about mobile phones? What about handies? What about smartphones? They are all part of this always on, always connected, everyone to everyone, very soon everything to everything, always and everywhere. And I am struggling because we don't yet have words or a phrase which really allow us to see how that will develop. Later on in this talk, I'm going to try and suggest where that might be going. Because after the human race, invented all of those things in the 19th century I mentioned, like automobiles and cars and railways and so on, in the 20th century, we invented computers and television, the internet, and today, the absolute pinnacle of technology is the smartphone, or the mobile phone, or the handy, or whatever you may call it. And my suggestion to you is that the word smartphone, or the words mobile phone or cell phone, are as useful in understanding where that device may be going as the phrase horseless carriage was for automobiles. So in a few minutes, I'll come back to that, and I will suggest where that's going, because it will affect you and your business. But I've been invited this afternoon to talk about the big key drivers that will shape the world in which we all have to live and do business in the next 10, 20, 30 years and beyond. And some of these are absolutely pertinent to what you do. The first key driver of the future is, and this is going to sound a bit like a mouthful, asynchronous population explosion, or uneven population explosion. Today, we are 7.2 billion people on the planet. The United Nations says that by 2030, we'll be 8.2 billion, by 2050, 9 billion, And recently, the University of Washington in Washington State, America, said that new research suggests that that 9 billion is going to go on increasing rapidly, and it's likely to become 10 billion and 11 billion. This is the future world into which we and our children and their children are venturing. How are we going to find the food, water, and energy for 50% more people on this planet? Can it be done? Is it a major problem? Well, the answer appears to be it can be done. Will it be stressful? It will. What does it mean for business? Well, the bottom line for the cynical is that it means an ever-growing market. For those who care about the planet, it means we must be even more careful about what we do. So that's the first key driver. We are going to increase the number of people on the planet dramatically. The second key driver comes out of the first, and this will affect you directly. It is the rapidly aging demographic of people in developed nations. And this is changing. I was taught, and my research led me to believe, for example, that Britain was one of the most aging societies. But that has changed in the last decade. And now, because of immigration, the UK is one of the most scintillating and growing societies, and soon 60 million people in the UK will become 70 million. And all of a sudden, UK society is no longer greying so rapidly. But at the same time, in the last week, it's been announced that Finland has overtaken Japan to become the most aging society in the world. So the nations in which you choose to operate are aging differently. Italy, with its tiny birth rate, is at the moment what we call a dying society. This may change the way that the UK has changed in the last 10 or 15 years. But the fact is that in Europe in particular, there's going to be a lot more older people. I was being asked the other day by a travel company, will these old people all be able to afford to travel? And I said, yes, some of them, but they may not be able to get health insurance for travelling. Although that is a topic I will return to in a minute. So the first two key drivers of the future are the growth in world population and the change in the demographics. The third key driver of the future is a very important one, but I'm not going to dwell on it. It is, of course, climate change. It hasn't gone away. We've had the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, and all of the fuss about the economies, for example, the Eurozone difficulties, have pushed the topic of climate change off the front page of newspapers and off the top of television news bulletins. But climate change has just continued inexorably. Now, I'm sure that when you move people around, you are conscious of what you're doing and the emissions that are produced along the way. I'm sure that many of your clients ask you to audit the carbon emissions and the footprints that you are responsible for as you go about your business. Even though this topic has disappeared off the news agenda, it will come back soon. So please remember, climate change is going to be ever more important as we move forward. The fourth, or rather, the fourth and related driver is the ongoing crisis in energy. And the reason it is an ongoing crisis is because we've got world population explosion. All of those new people will want more energy. We've got an aging demographic with less opportunity to find the money to pay for it. We've got climate change, which means we've got to have cleaner energy. So it sounds like a perfect storm. We have to find a lot more energy globally in the next 50 years, but do so in a way that's cleaner, that does less damage to our environment. And then we come on to the key driver, which is really responsible for the vibrancy of this meeting. This key driver affects you in particular. It is, of course, globalization. Now, globalization is a strange word, a strange term. In some rooms, when I say the word globalization, some audiences go, yeah, hurrah, where other audiences go, boo. But the fact is that globalization has done more to reduce global poverty in the last 20 years than all of the foreign aid given by the developed nations to the poorer nations since the end of the Second World War. Globalization, when conducted ethically and responsibly, is the greatest force for good on the planet. When a company from a developed nation goes into a poorer nation to set up perhaps a call center or a factory or an office or a research lab or whatever it is, when that's done ethically, responsibly and sustainably, it boosts the local economy and it gives young people an opportunity of a career. In particular, if you offer a young man in a very poor society the opportunity of a job and a career, and I'm being sexist deliberately by picking out young men, he will be far less likely to become a terrorist, to take up arms against the rich nation. Because a lot of terrorism is actually the cry of the dispossessed against the rich. Even though much of it is dressed up as religious ideology, it is in fact the cry of the poverty against the rich. And globalization is a key to reducing that cry. Globalization has to be done ethically and responsibly, and you all have a role in this. How well it works depends on how well people are moved, how happy they are in their location. You are facilitators of globalization, and you are a product of it. I was asking some questions about this organization before this conference started, and I've discovered that the real growth in your industry has come from the early 90s till today. Specifically, really starting to move by about 95, 96. Exactly in line, unsurprisingly, with the momentum of globalization. But since the financial crisis, globalization has changed. And I now call it Globalization 2.0 because it's different, as you will have noticed. The first thing is that it's become two-way. It used to be people going from the rich nations to the poorer nations. That's how it started. Now it's as likely to be people coming from the poorer nations to the rich nations as the other way around. And equally, many of the businesses that were sent offshore in the 1990s are being returned to onshore with all of the movements involved, which of course is terribly good news for you. And the reason that they're being returned and reshored is, of course, the fact that robots and artificial intelligence are making the economies of carrying out some operations in developed territories very attractive again. In the 90s, in the noughties, it might have made good economic sense to base manufacturing in a very low-cost territory. But when today you can get an army of low-cost robots and use artificial intelligence to run a call center with perhaps 1/10 of the number of humans, it isn't so clear that you actually need it to be far away in a low-cost territory. Will people therefore stop being relocated? Will they stop traveling so much? The short answer, of course, is, as you know, the answer is no, they will not stop. They will continue to move and be relocated as finance becomes truly global. Globalization isn't slowing down, it isn't halting, it's merely changing. And it's becoming multidimensional and multi-directional. All of a sudden, every business that starts thinks within 10 years we want to be a multinational. I'll give you an example of that. Uber, the company that makes the taxi app, only started 7 years ago. Today it operates in 200 cities around the world. Its staff are in 200 cities around the world. And then all of a sudden you begin to think of all of the other companies that have come from nowhere and have gone global within a few years. Facebook, Airbnb, Twitter, I could go on. Globalization is the future. It isn't changing. The sixth key driver of the future is one that absolutely fascinates me. It is the multiple revolutions in healthcare, in medicine. Now, as I stand here looking out at your faces, I see that you're actually quite a young bunch. You look very youthful to me. And therefore, what I have to say may surprise you. If you ever think about it, how long do you think you're going to live? On average, you might think to yourself, well, my mother lived to be 90 years old. Therefore, if I'm lucky and I don't get run over or I don't get some terrible disease, I'll probably live to be a healthy 90. That would be very nice, thank you. But medicine is changing. Medical science is moving at the speed of light. That doesn't mean that national health services are moving at the speed of light, but medicine itself is moving very quickly. Because of four big developments. The first is digital health technology. 2 days from now, on Friday this week, if you want to, you can spend money and buy an Apple Watch, a smartwatch, and it will tell you your heart rate at any moment. A year from now, or 18 months, it will tell you your blood pressure and your blood glucose level, which is useful if you think you might be diabetic or on the way to being diabetic. As these things develop, if I were to meet you here again in 5 years or 10 years, 50% of you would actually be wearing some sort of health watch or wristband or a pin or a brooch or another device which would be all part of wearable health technology. You wouldn't be wearing it because you are hypochondriacs. You would not be wearing it because you worried about your health. You'll be wearing it because of the advantages it gives you in terms of your health insurance, in terms of your wellness, your fitness. So that's the first driver, which may seem at first like something fairly small, but it isn't. The second key driver is DNA profiling. I have had my DNA decoded. Anyone else here had their DNA decoded? Oh, for you lot, DNA stands for do not ask. DNA tells me that if I'm on a cruise ship and there's an outbreak of the norovirus, the sickness bug, I can't get sick. I can't catch it. It also tells me that I don't have any particular genes that predispose me to, what's that illness called? Alzheimer's. But that doesn't mean I'm not going to get it. You mustn't make that mistake of thinking about that with DNA. And then, of course, there is stem cell research. We are going to have, in due course, rejuvenation therapies, and we're going to have stem cell treatment, which will give us replacement organs, certainly in 10 years, 15 years' time, which means that when I'm 90, I will probably look like I'm 30. But will I still want to go out clubbing in the evenings? But for you and your children and their children, you're probably going to live a lot longer than you think. Perhaps if you're under 40 years old, you're guaranteed to be 100 on average. If you're under 30, probably 110. If any of you here are even younger, then who knows how long you'll live. For goodness sake, make sure your pension plans are paid up. The seventh key driver of the future is this topic we've been talking about, which is this exponentially accelerating technology. And I said to you, I promised that I would try to describe where the smartphone, where this technology is taking us. Well, I have a confession to make. I am, in fact, a visitor here this afternoon from the year 2030. And I stand in front of you with my constant companion, Maria, who lives just behind my left ear. And Maria is my personal companion, my personal assistant, and she does everything for me. She's been with me for 15 years, since that long ago year of 2015. I called her Maria because I'm with her so much, and my own wife's name is Maria, and I realized that if I were to say the name Maria in my sleep, I wouldn't want there to be any horrible misunderstandings about who I was speaking to. But you will have already guessed that Maria is what my smartphone has become. She is merely part of my body network, this almost invisible network that connects me to the outside world, which runs my business, which helps me to stay in contact at all time. Maria is the answer to information overload. She helps me do my work, and you will all have a Maria or a Thomas or a Julian or a Barbara, whoever it may be, working alongside you within 5 to 10 years. Now, I'm going to wrap up my formal presentation in a moment, and I'm going to ask you for comments and questions and criticisms if you have them. But above all, I want to hear what you think the future offers. I'm going to end my formal presentation by saying that it's clear to me we've entered a new and previously unrecognized phase in the global economy. Yesterday afternoon, I was in Stockholm talking to institutional investors, hedge fund managers, and they identified the fact that, especially in America, companies are making more money than ever, which of course is good news for you. They are your clients. But human labor is not sharing as much in the bonanza as the corporations and capital themselves. Equally, at the same time as this money is being made, inflation is being held very low. And of course, we have a situation where nobody can quite understand how this is possible. I suspect the answer is that the internet and apps and the digital world is creating the new economy that people have been talking about for 10 or 15 years. I think it's happening now, and actually, economically, I think the future is outstanding. I wish you well in enjoying and participating in the continuing globalization of business. Thank you for listening. Thank you. Now, I would love, we're going to break in a little while to have drinks and so on, but if anybody has a question or comments, I think there are some microphones. I'd love to hear from you. Microphone at the back, I can see one there. All I need to see is a hand. Anyone? There's a gentleman there, I can see who he is as well, that's Dom. He's decided he's going to be first. Dom.
Do you have any idea who might invent Maria?
Yes, it's going to be one of the new technology companies. And it was funnily enough, Dom, you mentioned that it was back in the year 2015. I popped into my mobile phone shop. I got a new model, and the guy behind the counter said to me, "There's a very clever assistant in this device. You may give her her name or his name, and he or she will become your companion." It's going to be one of the big names, I suspect. But thank you for that. Anybody else before we... There's a question over here, a young lady with her arm up. In fact, she's so young, I suspect she's going to live to be 140. Have we got... There's a microphone coming round. Hello.
Hi, I'm Yasmin. You talked about the number of, people, the population increasing,
Yes.
and obviously part of this population is the poor, the poverty.
Yes.
How do you think technology is going to have an impact on the poverty, or is it going to have an impact on the poverty? Because this is going to be one of the most important problems coming up, I think.
Your question is so perfect, I almost believe I planted you in the audience myself. Because I've got a clock on that lectern, and I could see I was running out of time. And that meant I couldn't mention the 8 eighth key driver of the future. And the eighth key driver of the future is the bottom 2 billion people, the poorest people in the world. And these 2 billion people, they live in 64, 65 nations, most of them, but not all of them, in sub-Saharan Africa. For example, the ones who aren't in Africa, think of North Korea, think of Haiti, think of Burma. I could go on. These people are playing no part in globalization. And your question is perfect, because you allow me to say, to issue this warning, that if in the next 10, 20 or 30 years, our governments do not invite these people in, if we do not include them in global development, they'll come and get us. They will come and get us. There's an old saying in Africa that if you exclude a boy from the village, if you exclude him, he will return as a man and burn the village down. That would be the effect of treating these nations the way we treated Somalia. We have to include the bottom bottom 2 billion. Thank you so much for mentioning that. Any more? Gentleman here in the white jacket. This is your exercise for the day, isn't it? I can see that. My goodness. Thank you. Sir.
In the past, the different countries of the world have had quite different cultures and religions and languages.
Yes.
But one of the implications, perhaps, of globalization is that those differences are becoming more confused, are less apparent. Do you think that is something that's going to continue, and how will that affect the world community?
Excellent question again, because globalization that doesn't respect cultural differences will fail. Cultural differences, when they are positive, and by that I mean there are some very negative cultural differences in some discrete parts of the world, they are to be celebrated. And it is part of ethical and responsible globalization. And you will know this better than anybody. Understanding cultural differences. When you are moving an executive from one part of the world to a completely different culture, I will bet that understanding and helping that person to understand the culture into which he or she is moving will be key to making that relocation a success. The answer to your question is, if local differences are diffused and dissolved, and as it were, the world becomes one, I think the world will be a poorer place. I believe we can do globalization in a way that respects and enhances old cultures and allows them to thrive whilst meshing with the world. But of course, it's not up to me. But thank you very much for that question. Madam, there's a lady here. My God, she's so young, she's going to live to be 200 years old.
Sorry.
Thank you.
Thank you. Not sure if this is within your expertise, but do you also, what's the future of the workplace?
Well, it's funny you should ask, because I was speaking at a conference about the future of work in London 1 month ago. And the topic was agile working, does it have a future? And agile working is defined as working any place, any time, not necessarily fully employed. And what I realized as I was researching the topic, and what I discovered as I was speaking to employment professionals, is this. Agile working, which means people working, as it were, from home or wherever they are, works, but not all the time. In other words, if you're a busy executive, you can do a lot just with a smartphone, just with a phone, just with email, just by meeting people. But you can't live that way unless you meet with your colleagues on a regular basis. So if I were in that position, I know that to be successful, I could certainly do 3 days away from the office, but I would need to be back with my colleagues, back in the office 1-2 days a week, not just because I want the human contact, but because with human contact, I get other people's ideas. I can say, I have this client, I'm not sure what the best thing to do is, I can get advice. More importantly, I have peer pressure, whether it's approval or disapproval. So what is for clear is that more and more agile working is the future. But if we say to our workers, to our employees, to our people, well, you won't need an office, you won't need to come back to base, we've got it wrong. There needs to be a place where people are part of the team, because the team is what makes each of us do even better than we can on our own. Thank you for that question. It was a very, very good question. There's a hand here, a lady here, and I'm aware that I'm standing between you and a glass of wine, which is a very dangerous place to be. Yes, madam.
Yes, hello, good evening. I'm Alica.
Hello.
And I wanted to ask about the development of language.
Yes.
You know, I'm not English, but
Yes.
of course I love English language, and it's becoming, you know, like the English that we all use.
Yes.
Do you think that the rest of the languages will survive?
Yes, I believe that all of the languages that are in use today will survive and continue. But there is something else about language which is very strange. A parent asked me recently, should I should I send my 11-year-old son, a British person, to Chinese Mandarin lessons so that he can learn Mandarin to be successful in business? Because surely when my 11-year-old is 25 years old, Chinese Mandarin is going to be the most common language in the world. And I said, no, don't teach your son Mandarin. Don't teach them French, don't teach him German, don't teach him any language if it is for business purposes, because Google Translate or Apple Translate or Microsoft Translate within that time frame will be perfect. Today, it's already very good. But as you will know, if you want to understand a culture, you need to learn the language. And what's most important, if you want to have a different view of the world, the best way is to have a look at the world through another language. What I learned the moment I started to look at Mandarin about the words for the future, about the words for the past, and the way that the Chinese look at the future and the past, completely changed my thinking about the future. But that's another topic. So the answer is, yes, I believe that all of the languages in use today are likely to survive and flourish because they are a way of thinking as well as just a communications tool. I'm looking at the clock and we're actually over time. I need to hand back to Francis, but thank you very much for being a lovely audience. Thank you very much.